Welcome to this video about net interest expense. The whole purpose of this video is to get us thinking about the difference among these three lines: interest expense, interest income, and the net of the two. Unfortunately, a lot of companies only report the net of the two. We don't get these two rows, we just get the net. It's tempting to use that in this model when we're trying to calculate our interest expense as a percentage of debt or our interest income as a percent of average cash. Those two numbers, they're interest rates. They're the rate that this company appears to be paying on its debt and the rate that it appears to be earning on its cash. Let me jump over to a personal finance example just to make this clear. In this personal finance example, I have a savings account with 10 grand in it, and over a period of time, I earned $500 in income, interest income. That means that the implied interest rate on that savings account is 5%. I get that by dividing the $500 by the 10,000. And we'll assume that's not a balance sheet snapshot. That's just the average of the balance in that account during the period in which I earned the 500. Similarly, let's say that I had a car loan of $5,000 and I had to pay some interest on that. I had to pay $550. So what would the implied interest on that car loan be? Well, I'd do the same thing. I would take the interest rate as the $550 divided by the car loan, which is $5,000, and I would get 11%. That's the that's the implied interest rate on the car loan. Now, if I didn't have these two numbers, is there anything I could do with this one to learn anything? That'd make a great quiz question, and the answer is no. This is a completely worthless number. Reason being, if I tried to do anything with it, like divide the net interest expense by the debt or by anything else, I would get a completely meaningless number, like in this case, negative 1%. But imagine if, in fact, I had $11,000 in savings. In this case, my net interest is 0%. And my calculation over here is even more worthless, if it can be more worthless. So net interest expense, as you can tell here, is meaningless. That's the whole point of this video. Why do we care about interest expense or net interest expense anyway? Well, you know from the pro forma model videos that you've watched that this template is all about looking at history, coming up with a ratio, and then using that to forecast using our drivers. For example, we might want to calculate sales growth and see, take this year divided by this year minus 1, we see a sales growth of 4%. Well, that tells us a lot about what we might want to think sales could grow in the future. If we're looking at interest expense as a percentage of average debt, we want to take our interest expense divided by the average debt and find out that this company seems to pay about 5% on their debt in interest. Let's see how much they make on their cash. We would take the interest income divided by their average cash, and it appears that they're earning about 1% on their cash. Again, the purpose of this video is if your company doesn't have these broken out, if all they give you is the net interest expense as required by GAAP, then don't use it. You will just have to estimate what you think that their cost of debt might be in the future and what they could earn on their cash in the future, but you will not know what they've had to pay in the past unless you can find information elsewhere. Let's look at a couple of examples. This is an example from Ralph Lauren's income statement and balance sheet for the years ending fiscal year 21, 22, and 23. And Ralph Lauren gave us an interest expense and interest income, and they didn't give us a net, which is fine because we don't like nets anyway. So let's see what their implied interest rates were. So their implied interest rate for expense would be the amount of expense they paid divided by the average amount of debt that they had. Now let's see what the average amount of debt that they had here in the denominator is. Take the average of, come down here to the current liabilities, and I see long-term debt, current portion of long-term debt. That sounds like something that might incur some interest. So I'll take that and close that parentheses and add in the average of the long-term debt. That also sounds like something that would incur interest. As I look through the rest of these liabilities, I don't see any other line items that sound to me like something that would incur interest that's reported up here on row 13. So I think that's going to give me the implied interest rate. Very important that on the income statement, since it covers all 12 months, it took us 12 months to have to pay that 40.4 million in interest. And we came into the year with about 500 in debt plus 11. So we came in with about 1.6 billion in debt and then left the year with about 1.1 billion in debt. So I'll bet the average balance of debt was probably somewhere around 1.35 or something like that. So if we use that 1.35 on the bottom by averaging those two, and that's what we're dividing our interest by that. Get the implied interest rate, Alt-HP to change that to a percent, Alt-HAL to move it over here. That's the 3%, Alt-HO to see a decimal, and again, 2.91% that it appears to cost Ralph Lauren to borrow money. Seems kind of low, but these are older numbers, could be some older debt. Let's see about their cash. If we take their interest income, divide that by, I'm going to go ahead and start an open parentheses, divide it by the average of their cash and equivalents plus the average of their short-term investments. Both of those things sound like items that might generate some interest income. We could debate whether the second one is or not. We might look at this number both ways, but when I run that number, copy that format, it's about 1.55. So I feel good that the implied cost of debt is lower than the implied interest rate on savings. So it makes sense, and this is what we want to learn from these income statements, is how these lines all work together. That was Ralph Lauren. Let's take a look at Apple now. Notice on the income statement that Apple didn't really tell us anything about interest expense or interest income. From reading the notes, I know that the closest they got is right here. I'm going to color that a slightly different color. Now, I'm not sure what kind of interest that is, so I'm going to look closer at the notes and pull in one of the notes to the financial statements, which includes this table. And Apple in their 10K broke out interest and dividend income, interest expense, and then a much smaller number that oscillates between positive and negative and is never more than about 10% of the row above it. And so the total of those three items is what got reported over here on the green line. That is not what we want. What we want is the interest and dividend income and the interest expense. Then, like before, we could calculate our implied interest rates. And I realized that I left them on here from my practice run of this video. So I'm going to move it up here, see what it looks like. Here we're taking the interest and dividend income and dividing it by, start our parentheses before we start saying average, dividing that interest income by the average of cash and cash equivalents. That sounds like something that could earn interest. Plus the average of marketable securities. That sounds like something that could earn dividends. Plus the average of non-current marketable securities, which may also earn some dividends. When we take the ratio of those two, we get an implied interest rate of 2.25%. It's like Apple's earning a little bit more. Apple probably is able to invest in some nice opportunities. And if we look at their cost of borrowing, Their cost of borrowing is their interest expense divided by, inside parentheses, the average of 3 different items. And those items are their very short-term debt, the commercial paper, their term debt that's due within the next period under current liabilities, and their term debt that's due beyond the next period. So we need to add all those 3, but before we can add them, we need to average them. When we run our ratio here, we get 3.4% cost of borrowing. Again, Apple can borrow quite a bit more attractive rates than some companies. Then the question remains, these other expenses, these aren't even interest, they're very small, we can ignore them. Does the net interest do us any good? Is there anything we could glean from this number, which is the only one that they give us on the income statement? And the answer is, again, a resounding no. It's a completely worthless number. Whole point of this video is to ignore net interest expense. One last thing, let's jump over here. I've been putting a lot of averages in the denominator, but you'll notice that once you get all of those different types of cash and marketable securities onto one line in the template, you may pull that from the Edgar data and put it on one line. You'd consolidate it here, so you won't have to add multiple averages together, because each one of these ratios is just going to have one average on the bottom. This one will have the average of debt, and this one will have the average of cash. So to summarize, if Ralph Lauren gives us the breakout, then we're very happy. We just populate our template with those 2 numbers and let the template calculate the ratio. If Apple gives us the breakout elsewhere, then we can take these 2 numbers into the template, but in order to keep our net income trued up, we need to also take these numbers in the template, because remember, we need all 3 rows to get here. Let's see if the template has space for all 3 of these rows. Interest income, interest expense, and other expenses. The template has space for interest expense and interest income. It doesn't precisely have something called other expenses. It's got this other non-operating expense on the template. I would just throw that number in there. It's very small. And if you don't throw it in there, then your net income won't match the income statement. So you need a place to put it. Let's look at one more company. Let's look at Nike and say, what did they give us? So revenues, costs, SG&A, they give us a line for interest expense and income net. And then they get into the other items. So my question for you is this line of any value? Can we use that row to calculate implied interest rates? Think about it. Absolutely not, because that's a net. So when we see that word net, we need to go to the 10K and see if we can find the income and the expense broken out separately. And now you know why. Thanks for watching.